Star, what are you doing?
Farm life was very different from city life. The animals were very much a part of living in the country. The rooster was the alarm clock.
At home, I'd say the neighbor on the east was over half a mile, the neighbor on the west half a mile.
All these farms were pretty much self-sufficient. They cut their own wood, they had wood fires, they grew a lot of their own food, they had their milk cows, they had a few mules to work the land. So this farm is pretty much typical of what Mecklenburg County used to look like.
But that's just the way people did. It's a different way of life.
I want you to observe these. Cars, traffic, noise, congestion, pollution. You know, most people, a lot of people, think that this is the way Mecklenburg County has always been. Traffic, congestion, cars, beeping horns, people on cell phones driving down the street. But the reality is that for most of its history, at least until the mid-1900s, Mecklenburg County was farms. It wasn't cars, it was mules. It wasn't trucks, it was horses. It wasn't going to the grocery store, it was growing your own food. That was the way of life for most people in Mecklenburg County. And yet that whole way of living on a farm, growing up on a farm, is virtually gone. It is vanishing. The only thing we have left are a few structures, a few buildings that remind us of Mecklenburg County's rural past.
This was once all agricultural fields. This was once large cotton fields. This was the Withers farm. The Withers family farmed this property in the 20th century. Evidence of Mecklenburg County's earliest agricultural history are very hard to find these days. Come with me, I'll show you something very special. Right now we're walking through the woods, but once this was all farmland. This is the Robson Rock House ruin, built between 1780 and 1810. This would have been considered pretty much the top of the line in terms of an agricultural home during that period, during the earliest settlement. The stone construction is reminiscent of the stone construction from Scotland or from Northern Ireland, where the Scot-Irish immigrated from. It also was found in Pennsylvania and in Maryland, both areas that fed the Piedmont of North Carolina during the early period of settlement. We're extremely lucky to have this remnant of the early history of Mecklenburg County. So many of the early dwellings were logged and have been lost to us simply because the log buildings disintegrated over the centuries. But the stone has survived, and it tells us a lot about the people who settled the area and how they lived. Behind me is a typical 18th century farmhouse for Mecklenburg County. There were larger houses, plantation houses, and places such as Robinson Rock House, but this is typical. It's log construction. Logs were the most abundant building material available to the early settlers. There was a completely forested area when Mecklenburg County was settled. Thus, the easiest thing to build your homes and your agricultural buildings out of would be logs. And this technology, this half dovetail is what it's called, construction method, appears to have traveled down the Shenandoah Valley, down the Great Wagon Road, into the Piedmont of North Carolina. We can follow the diffusion of the building style. While we have several good examples of the early homes of the settlers, the early farmhouses, less common are the outbuildings. Right behind me is a kitchen building. It's got a masonry fireplace or a masonry chimney. And farther back we have an agricultural outbuilding used for the production of whatever crops are growing here. Inside the house, the biggest difference between the homes of the early settlers and a modern home is the size, the space. They may do with much less space.
Some Mecklenburg County houses became very spacious after 1794. That's when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And that made the growing of short staple cotton very profitable in the Piedmont. The planter class in Mecklenburg County emerged and began to build grand houses, like the Greer Ray house here behind me. Or Rosedale. Or Ingleside. Or Cedar Grove. Or Holly Bend. The planter class also began to build churches, like Providence Presbyterian Church, or Sharon Presbyterian Church. The only original part of the church remaining is the cemetery. Or Hopewell Presbyterian Church.
Little boy, what you want me to tell you? Little boy, what you want me to tell you? Oh, in them long, hard days, he said, you tell you left me rolling. He said, said,
Slavery was a big part of the history of Mecklenburg County. In 1860, 40% of the overall population was comprised of slaves. Here we are at the front door of the church. Now you might think this is the only door to the church. It's the most prominent one, but there's a second door. Before the Civil War, the enslaved people in Mecklenburg County did not have their own churches. They generally went to the church of the folks who owned the slaves. Now, this is referred to as the servant's entrance, and that's a euphemism for the slave entrance. This is where the slaves would enter the sanctuary. They would not go through the front door. And this is a vivid reminder of the institution of slavery, a vivid reminder of how they adapted society and culture to accommodate slavery. We need to go into the woods one more time.
well, that gal out there for never move. Oh, in them long, hot summer days. That gal, I'm on my way back there. Hallelujah. That gal, I'm on my way back there.
This is the McCoy Slave Cemetery. This is a very significant place. It helps us understand slavery in Mecklenburg County. There aren't many artifacts of slavery that have survived, aside from the large plantation houses. Other than the large plantation houses, we do have some slave cemeteries, such as this. But this slave cemetery is different than the others in that we've got this large monument here to some of the folks that are buried here, and it was erected by the Albert McCoy heirs in honor and in memory of his slaves. Slavery was a very personal and complex institution.
The Civil War destroyed the social structure of the Old South. But one thing it did not destroy was the power of cotton. Cotton continued to be the principal cash crop of Mecklenburg County. Cotton became even more important with the advent of the railroad, meaning that cotton could be more easily shipped, with cotton mills coming to town. And a new labor system arose, sharecropping. Mainly African Americans. They'd lived on the old plantation. They continued to live on the farm.
A lot of times they'd build a tenant house and get a tenant in, and then they'd have another plow hand. I probably paid them $1 a day. I'm not sure, but that's what I remember, I think.
In this area of the country, cotton was the commodity that paid the bills on the farm. Everything hinged around cotton. You know, you read the stories about King Cotton, and that was true. And the barn was the focal point that where the livestock or the mules stayed that worked the cotton. You had to have the mules to plow, to do everything you did. You had the mules.
That is surrounded by what was traditional cotton land, and this barn was built in approximately 1895 or so, and as you can tell, it was built from all timber cut off the land. These are 2-inch thick planks, rough sawed, and it was built probably as what a farmer would call a mule barn.
We had a 2-mule farm, and it was handled by the family, and once in a while we'd get an extra mule and have 3
When I was a boy, mules were really a big business because tractors were just beginning to be used in the 40s and 50s. But mules were the mainstay of the work animals on a farm.
A two mule farm. A 2 mule farm is where you didn't have anybody else to plow.
And then as you got larger, you got more valuable. They take the hoe away from you and put you behind the mule. And then it was you and the mule until you left home.
Yeah, my grandfather always said that when a young man started out farming, he should build himself a nice barn. And the reason for saying that was if you had a nice barn and you took care of your livestock, your mules, your horse, your cattle, then that good barn would eventually build you a nice home.
We still have buildings, but we're losing them fast, especially the barns. They're almost totally gone. And it's not going to be long before we lose the human connection, because the generation that grew up or visited rural farms is going to be leaving us. And if you want to know what life was like on a rural farm, just to listen.
Our day usually started about 5 in the morning, and the milk cow would be milked and the mules would be fed.
It is picturesque in its own kind of way. And I look at pictures in books and I read about it, and it looks like a wonderful, relaxing way of life. And it is, if you're looking at pictures in a book, or if you're looking at some cows, you know, in a movie, and it just looks like, oh, to return to that way of life. No, it was hard. It was a lot of work to stay warm in the winter, to stay cool in the summer. Survival was dependent on what you raised out there in the dirt. And my relatives spent a lot of time looking at the sky because life was so dependent on what the weather did.
Yes, honey, it was hard. You had a sack on your back that went across your shoulder, and you picked them birds out there and put that cotton in there. And then my daddy would take it to the gin. They take it to a gin, and that's when they turn it into bales of cotton.
Think about what we didn't have. No air conditioning. It was hot as hell, but you never knew any different. Think about it, no power lawnmowers. No leaf blowers, no weed eater. It was quiet.
It was a hard life. You worked hard for that little bit of money. That's all I can say. That's why I left from here. You didn't have any money when you only got paid once a year.
And before we went to bed, I said, where do I go to the bathroom? She said, well, there's a slop jar right here under the bed, and if you need to go, you just get up and go in that jar. It was about, you know, it was okay. I said, oh. Oh, I didn't like to go to the outhouse. I put it off as long as possible. I'd go down a little dirt path, and the bees were everywhere, the briars were everywhere. And I'd finally get there and get in it, and I'd look up to make sure a spider was not going to get in my hair. It was a nerve-wracking experience for me to go to the outhouse. I had a nice bathroom in Charlotte and a nice toilet and toilet paper.
Well, growing up on the farm was just the way everybody did it at that time. There was nothing unusual about growing up on the farm.
Another thing that was fun about the corn cribs, young boys enjoyed on days when it was raining, when they didn't have to work on the farm, they could go down to the corn crib and station themselves outside across from the corn crib and shoot rats.
I was always afraid I'd step in the manure. There's always a lot of manure.
I just can't begin to tell you about growing up, but my grandmother cooked on a wood stove.
Wood. She had little pieces of wood about that long, kindling they called it. She'd open the door and throw it in.
Well, we missed one thing, cutting stove wood blocks in the spring and splitting that big wood pile for that wood stove.
Yeah.
That was an every spring job, and when you came home from school, go out there and split blocks till you got that pile split up to cook with.
8 to 5 did not exist on the farm. It was daylight till dark.
Everything that anybody didn't want in the way of food or liquid went into the slop bucket. Everything went in there for the pigs, including the dish water that the dishes had been washed in. And then when Don would come home at night from work, he would take a big pail, about 3 feet high, it'd be full of dish water, watermelon rinds, everything that anybody didn't want went in the slop bucket to give to the pigs at dusk.
And a neighboring tenant farmer would walk up the driveway, and my granddaddy would get off the porch and talk to him, and they'd walk around and go in the smokehouse, and that tenant farmer would leave with a ham on his shoulder, because people shared and took care of each other. It was interesting. You know, that doesn't happen today. Now somebody wants you to give money all the time.
Because I know what tough days are like, and I know when I don't have money, I can make it without it. Many days I didn't have no money, so I made it. And we used to have to walk. If you had seen us walking to school, you wouldn't believe any of us got educated until we got in high school. We used to walk like 5 miles one way.
Everybody was always kind, always nice. I don't remember any yelling or fussing.
The adult people that I knew then, I never seen anybody drink. Drinking was not a problem. Most of them would chew tobacco or smoke, or something older, you know. But it's pretty. It was a safe place to be there. It felt like a safe place to be.
The way you looked was not very important. Women didn't wear makeup much. They would put some powder on, and they'd pinch their cheeks to get a little bit of red in them, and they might do their lips, you know, kind of like that, to put a little color in them. But the last thing you wanted to do was to dress up. They call women who wore makeup hussies. My mother said that my daddy told her that they had a lot of fun out in the barn, that you've heard that term, rolling in the hay. Well, the hay was stored up over the top, and I think they went out there, I think, that's where the boys took their girlfriends and they would just do whatever they wanted to do in the hay.
And he always said, my children come first. Anytime I'm planting something, I'm planting it for my children.
The cotton era of Mecklenburg County began to end in the 1920s when a bug, a bad bug, arrived in North Carolina from Mexico, the boll weevil.
So some of us tried to dust by hand and Wash Davis' store at Croft. Bought a little Ford tractor, and he was a hardware man and was able to find a sprayer somewhere. He put a sprayer on that little Ford tractor, and he turned it, put a man on it and turned it loose in this end of the county and down through Mallard Creek.
Have you ever picked cotton in Mecklenburg County? Have you ever plowed with a mule in Mecklenburg County? Well, if you have, you're a senior citizen. Because the boll weevil, that's what these men were spraying for, devastated the crop, the cotton crop of Mecklenburg County. That way of life is gone. Should we preserve elements of that past? Well, I think so. Might not have been beautiful, might not have been all wonderful, but it was part of our past for 150 years. Rural Mecklenburg.
Santa, don't you hear my Lord calling? Santa, don't you hear my Lord calling? Oh, Santa, don't you hear my Lord calling? Say over and you let it go. Oh, the hammer keep ringing. Ringing in somebody coffin.